All right, over the last couple of days, we've been diving into the troubling proposals that are buried in the nearly 2,500 pages. It's, to be exact, 2,465 pages that make up the Democrats' $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. Now, as we've made clear, this is on top of everything else. This isn't a normal budget. This is on top of all of that. This is on top of the $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. This is basically socialist spending. And so what we've been doing is we've been looking into it to see how it's going to impact your family, how it's going to impact the issue of the sanctity of human life. And if you've missed any of these last couple of days, you can go back and watch them at tonyperkins.com. Now, on Tuesday, we examined the anti-life aspects of the bill. Yesterday, we looked at the anti-family aspects. And today, we're going to look at the economic impact because, well, the Biden administration has repeatedly, the president himself and others have said that this will cost zero. Although more recently, they have been trying to clarify that, well, it's not quite zero for everybody. Here's what the White House press secretary said.
This is not going to cost the American public $1. We're going to pay for this by asking corporations, the highest income, so people under $400,000, I should say, corporations' highest income to cover the cost of these necessary investments.
So just to not dumb it down then, does the plan cost nothing or is the plan free?
The plan costs nothing for the American people who make less than $400,000.
For the American people who make less than $400,000, is that true? Now, they've been changing their tune. First, it cost nothing. It paid for itself. Somehow, we were just going to pick $3.5 trillion off of trees. Changing the tune. But is there more to this? With me now to discuss this, Connor Semelsberger. He's the Director of Federal Affairs here at the Family Research Council. Connor, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back again, Tony.
All right, let's start off with right where Jen Psaki took us, that this is not going to cost people who make under $400,000 a year a cent. Not $1. Not going to cost them a bit. Is that true?
Not at all. It's quite comical to watch the fact checking that needs done on the press reports of late out of the White House. But none of the statements Jen Psaki just said were true. 2 points. The 400,000 or less, that was discredited by not just the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is a bipartisan group, but even some left-wing progressive tax organizations have said that's just frankly false. Actually, if you make over $30,000 a year, your taxes are going to increase. And those that are going to see a major increase are those making between $75,000 and $100,000 a year, right in that middle class. So again, I don't know how anyone can take those comments seriously that this is going to cost nothing when they don't even have the tax revenue enough to even pay for the $3.5 trillion, let alone to only make it apply to corporations and high-income earners.
All right, so let's talk a few facts here. This would be the largest tax increase in more than 50 years. Is that correct?
That is correct, Tony.
And this would require more than $200 trillion in higher taxes to pay for the $3.5 trillion in spending. And that's on the low side. Some are saying it's going to go up as high as 4.3. Now, you mentioned this. The Joint Tax Committee has revealed this bill would increase taxes on anyone making $30,000 or more. And by 2027, families earning between $75,000 and $100,000 would see their taxes go up by a total of $3 billion. So there's no escaping this. But are corporations really going to pay this, or are they going to pass it off to the consumer?
Yeah, see, when you have a 2,500-page bill, that's where these things get hidden. They'll make it out to seem that it's just the wealthy Wall Street elites, those coastal elites that make up the Democratic Party. Those are the ones that are going to be taxed. And you at home, you American people, aren't going to see your taxes increase a cent. Rather, you're going to get all these goodies and benefits we hand you. But that's just frankly false. A large portion of this will go to the businesses, small and large businesses alike. But again, if you work for a business, if you buy anything made, manufactured, sold by a business, that's going to impact you and your family. The costs are just going to keep rising.
So we should really be looking at your purchasing power, your buying power. How is the bottom line of your family going to be impacted? Because, I mean, we have established that there are those that are making very clear that you're going to have to pay taxes. Now, 3/4 of this, to be fair, are targeted at corporations and small businesses. But as you pointed out, that's going to be passed on in various forms: higher prices. In fact, if you work for a small business and they have to pay higher taxes, that's money they can't give in raises. It's money they can't give in bonuses. It's additional positions they can't hire because they're giving this money to the government. But let's talk about two other aspects that are going to be impacted by this. I'm going to talk about inflation, and then I want to talk about the deficit and how that impacts people. Let's talk about inflation, where, all right, we've already seen a tremendous infusion of money into our economy through the COVID relief bills. We're already seeing the highest prices, price index increases in about 30 years, I think. And what's this going to do with another $3.5 trillion? And that's not to mention the 1.5 in infrastructure that's still out there. What's that going to do to inflation?
It's only going to keep rising. You know, just this week, I feel like I've seen gas prices go up 10, 15 cents every day just driving in here to DC every day. And that's only going to expand. You talk about lumber costs, transportation costs, all of that's already being impacted by inflation. All of us American families are feeling that already. You throw another $3.5 trillion at this economy for these socialist spending packages, that inflation is only going to increase. Now, Psaki and the like, they're going to keep trying to downplay this, that, oh, it's just a temporary thing, this inflation, it's because of the COVID spending. But I don't know how anybody, even the most progressive of economists, would say throwing even more spending at this is going to somehow lower inflation. Rather, the opposite would be true. And all of us just trying to, buy lumber to build a shed in your backyard, pay for gas, maybe buy a used car because your engine went. You're going to be the ones feeling this even more so if this package were to pass.
So is that going to impact the middle class?
Most definitely, more so than the higher income earners. They can adjust their incomes if you have flexible incomes or lots of savings. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, working hourly or shift work, those working class Americans, you're going to be feeling this the most.
I mean, I think we've seen already almost a 40% increase in fuel cost over year. So there is a significant rise in prices. But let's talk for a moment of the deficit and why we should be concerned about this. This was actually a discussion we had at the Pray Vote Stand Summit last week. And I actually have a clip here I want to play from my conversation I had on this with Senator Langford and Senator Marshall. We were discussing the debt. Play clip number 6.
Debt is not a big deal until it is. And the day that it is, and then it's everything.
Yeah.
And the day that it is, you can't predict. So right now, we're basically, as an economy, surviving because every other economy in the world is still struggling. At some point, if Europe gets its act together, which I know is a stretch, okay? If Europe gets its act together and people start investing in the euros rather than in dollars, our debt accelerates even faster and we get skyrocketing inflation. We can't predict that. We're basically betting every day that we're going to be less ugly than others.
And we were discussing the increase of the national debt. In fact, I was preparing for something that went back 40 years ago to the beginning of the Reagan administration. And our national debt was just under $1 trillion, about $995 billion. Today, it stands at almost $29 trillion in 40 years. And it took us from, as Senator Langford pointed out in our discussion last week, it took us from George Washington to George Bush to get to that $1 trillion mark. Now we are at $28 trillion. And the total spending that we've seen that's been going toward the debt because it's deficit spending, when you add the COVID relief packages of the last 18 months with the $1.5 trillion in infrastructure, and in this bill, we're looking at over $9 trillion in deficit spending that's going straight to the debt.
Yeah, Tony, it's outstanding, those numbers when you look at them. And you look at the COVID packages, right? An emergency situation, that could justify some emergency spending outside of that annual appropriations. But the past 5 COVID packages, for Biden to come into office, pass another COVID package, then to talk about all these new spending packages, again, $9 trillion new dollars in deficit spending, it's going to come back to bite us. And again, the Republicans aren't innocent in all this. A lot of this went up under the Trump administration as well. But at the same time, this is the time to reel back the spending, reel back that spending, because they think if we just tax more, we can spend more. But latest reports have showed that the spending is really what's increasing the deficit, not the lack of taxes.
Yeah, let's talk about that for just a moment, because there is this idea, well, government is not getting enough money. It's gotten a record intake. I mean, last year, the government collected 4.047 trillion in revenue, with corporate tax collections jumping 75% as the economy reopened. I mean, when you look at the growth of revenue going into the government, we've seen record levels of that tax revenue grow. So this isn't an issue of not enough money coming in. It's too much money going out in the spending. And this is purely what this $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill is. It's just more spending. And as we've pointed out, a lot of this is not one-time spending.
Yeah, Tony, that really jumps off the page there, that we're actually bringing in more tax revenue even after the 2017 tax cuts. They expected, okay, we're going to cut taxes, a good thing, but we might bring in less revenue. We actually brought in more. They outmet the expectations that these, bipartisan tax groups have expected. So the taxes are coming in more than they even expected. It's the too much spending going out. And like you said, the spending isn't just a one-off, here's a program to start up for an emergency use. This is stuff we're talking 5 years out, 10 years out. And as we talked this week, these temporary programs that get funding for 5 or so years, they're never temporary. Those things get locked in, and we have to pay that price for decades to come.
So let's talk in this bill as well, talk about taxes, is a lump sum of $79 billion going to the IRS so that they can collect more tax revenue. I mean, what is the IRS going to do with $79 billion additional dollars?
Just lead to more waste, fraud, abuse, and even more power to target conservative organizations like ourselves to go after for tax fraud. I think that report that they brought in more revenue this year than expected totally discredits the point that the IRS needs more money. Even with the waste and fraud they're already undergoing, they reeled in those corporations. They brought in the tax revenue, even during COVID when oversight was lacking. So it can only lead to bad things when you send a slush fund to the IRS to just politicize yet another federal agency.
Let's shift gears for just a minute before we run out of time here. When we look at the cost of this, the additional taxes that are going to be taken, and again, 75% of this, 3/4 of it goes toward corporations, major corporations, but also small businesses get caught up in this. I'll have to say, I don't have much sympathy for the major corporations, because in large part, they are responsible for fueling the leftist in this country. They've lined up with the left's radical social policies. They've been facilitating them. And now, quite frankly, they're getting what they deserve, in my view.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Tony. I think it's a point that doesn't get brought up enough. Between Black Lives Matter, LGBT pride flags in June, to President Joe Biden calling up the Major League Baseball to move their All-Star game. These are the corporations that don't have our interests at heart, and yet here they are, probably the ones that helped push the Biden administration over the finish line in 2020 and elect a Democrat majority in the Congress. Now they're wagging their tails. They're walking home with their tail between their legs, because now they realize they're going to try to tax these same corporations to pay for all this stuff that apparently the corporations love, things like abortion funding and such, you name it. I don't think we should have any sympathy, and just goes to show that they're going to hopefully sleep in the bed that they make, that they could be the ones taking a big brunt of the taxes here. here and try to come cramming back to the pro-life conservative Republicans, and we'll see what happens politically with all of that.
And of course, many of these major corporations that were kind of coaxed to come back to the United States in terms of their manufacturing facilities and moving away from countries like China that uses slave or unpaid labor or not fairly paid labor, like using the Uyghurs as religious minorities in China to produce some of their products. I mean, this is going to drive many of these corporations to go back overseas into these tyrannical countries.
Yeah, Tony, the corporate tax rate lowering was one of the best things the Trump administration did from this standpoint, that it kept manufacturing and businesses here in the U.S. Coming from Western Pennsylvania, where steel mills and coal mines are prevalent, having manufacturing businesses have been huge for our economy. And I've seen that firsthand in the communities I grew up in, having American businesses here. Rather, it's going to force them overseas.
Connor, we're out of time. Sorry about that. We're going to have to leave it there, but we'll finish this. We'll continue this conversation as we look at this reconciliation bill. Connor, thanks so much for joining us.